readers are members of ACSM, an association for which you once worked, and you can remind us of your days at ACSM if you'd like. What does MAPPS provide that ACSM and its member organizations, like the National Society of Professional Surveyors, do not or may not?
Well, first of all, because of the difference in the structure of the two organizations, the fact that MAPPS is made up of companies, its members are companies, whereas ACSM is made up of primarily individuals, that's a difference right there. The focus of ACSM, I think properly, is on the profession, where the focus of MAPPS, while certainly stressing issues of professionalism, is the business of being in a surveying and mapping practice in the private sector. So we provide, I think, information that may be not quite as technical in terms of our publications, the content of our conferences, our education programs. We tend to provide the kind of information, kind of education that the principal owner, partner of a firm needs to develop and employ technology, bring it to the market, and make money with it. So we don't
business in today's environment.
Exactly. So we tend to not get into the details of technology. We don't train people how to push the buttons, how to run an instrument. We are more involved in educating our members on emerging technologies, what the collection process is, what kind of data an instrument will collect, what the applications are, and where can you make money with a particular technology. So that's the major difference between the two organizations. Is one is more of a technical and technical and professional approach, where MAPPS is much more of a business approach.
Very good. MAPPS often co-locates its meetings with ASPRS events, such as the recent PCORA Symposium. And you mentioned ASPRS earlier, and the makeup of their membership and their role. Can you compare and contrast those roles a little bit further, the two organizations? And do you see them as being complementary to one another?
We have long viewed ASPRS and ACSM as complementary organizations. A great number of the principals, owners, partners of MAPPS member firms are individually members of ACSM or ASPRS. And as I said earlier, the difference is that ACSM and ASPRS tend to be much more technical. We tend to be much more business-oriented. Back in the 1990s, we began a relationship with ASPRS that originated with the advent of soft copy photogrammetry. And we started hosting a specialty conference jointly with ASPRS to educate our members on the advent of soft copy photogrammetry and what that meant for their businesses, for their collection and processing, and for the markets and applications that they're involved in. And over time, that has evolved into a very strong partnership. We do a joint conference every 3 years where we try to focus on a particular set of emerging technologies. And so those are different than a traditional fall ASPRS meeting in that they do tend to be featuring more practical presentations as opposed to very technical or academic types of papers and presentations. And we're always looking for opportunities to do the same with other organizations. When there's a synergy and a common interest, we're more than happy to work with other groups.
John, we talked a little bit about the beginnings of MAPPS in the 80s, but tell us a little bit about your personal background of how you got into this whole line of work.
Well, I began working with the surveying and mapping community in 1982. At that time, ACSM and ASP were planning a merger, or what they called a consolidation. And ACSM had a government affairs program, a fledgling government affairs program at that time, with an outside consultant. And the decision was that as a transition to the merger or consolidation, the two organizations would form a joint government affairs program. And I was working as a staff assistant for a congressman on Capitol Hill, and I was hired to come in and start that joint government affairs program. And I like to think it was a very successful program right from the beginning. We immediately had some success on a number of issues. First of all, back in the late 70s, the Surface Mining Act was enacted into law. It was a very controversial piece of environmental legislation. In the 11th hour, Congress had approved a provision that said that maps and cross-sections of surface coal mine areas shall be certified by a professional engineer or a geologist. And that is what the final federal law said. Well, that superseded and overrided almost 50 state surveying licensing laws. There was no desire on anybody's part in Congress to reopen the Surface Mining Act. But we rolled up our sleeves, looked at different ways to try to change that, and we ended up working with Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, a very powerful senator at the time, and actually did a provision on an appropriations bill that reasserted the land surveyor as a lead professional. And that was probably our first big victory with ACSM, and that was followed in 1988 with the enactment of the very first and to this day only amendments to the Brooks Act, which clarified that surveying and mapping fell under qualifications-based selection under the Brooks Act. So we had a number of victories. A number of other things that we did. In the 1986 Tax Reform Act, we preserved cash-based accounting for surveying and mapping firms, which was originally proposed to be banned or prohibited. And we did a study and found that as much as a third of a surveying and mapping firm's accounts receivable are outstanding at any one point in time in their fiscal year. And if they were forced into doing accrual accounting, they would have to pay tax on income that they had not yet realized and might not realize if it is a bad debt. So we were able to preserve for surveying and mapping firms, and it's right in the law, that firms in our field could continue to use cash accounting. We were able to win amendments to the Superfund law that took the surveyor out of the chain of strict joint and several liability. There was a court decision after the original Superfund law was passed that basically said if there's somebody left that was involved in the hazardous waste site that has any money in their pockets, they could be sued even if they were not involved in actually creating the hazardous waste site in the first place. There was a court case where the bank that held the mortgage note on the property was the deep pocket, and that is who was sued because the polluter was gone and out of business. And so the feeling was we should not be holding that same standard with regard to the guys in the white hats who come in to clean up a site, the engineer, the surveyor, the mapping firm. So we were successful in getting indemnification, in getting removal from the chain of strict joint and several liability, and we got some QBS provisions in the Superfund law as well. So I had a great experience working with the surveying community. I have a deep affection for surveyors. And then when MAPPS started to grow and they relied on me a little bit more while I was still working at ACSM and ASPRS. From the very beginning, when MAPPS was created, it financially supported my program at ACSM and ASPRS. They would make a contribution every year, and MAPPS was much more of a smaller volunteer organization.